What happens when a former empire tries to reassert dominance over nations it once colonized, only to be met not with fear or deference, but with quiet, unwavering resistance? What happens when the script of global power is flipped, and those written off as peripheral become central to a new geopolitical reality? That is precisely the moment unfolding right now between France and the nations of the Sahel, particularly Burkina Faso, under the leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. French President Emmanuel Macron recently attempted to issue a diplomatic warning that, for many, sounded like an ultimatum. In response, he was not met with aggression or chaos, but with a calm, dignified silence, followed by a response so direct, so full of conviction, that it echoed far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. France, long accustomed to playing puppeteer in West Africa, is finding its strings cut. The Sahel is rewriting the narrative. Macron's statement at a Paris press conference seemed routine on the surface. He claimed that nations distancing themselves from democratic norms and global cooperation will suffer consequences. Yet it was clear to observers and analysts alike who his words were aimed at. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, members of the newly formed Alliance of Sahel States, AES, countries that have thrown off French military presence, rejected foreign political meddling, and are now charting a future grounded in sovereignty and mutual regional support. But this time Macron's speech didn't draw applause, it drew backlash, because the rules have changed. The AES, born from a spirit of regional solidarity and historical awareness, stands as a declaration that Africa will no longer be coerced into submission by the very powers that once enslaved and exploited it. This is not rebellion, it is reclamation. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's response, delivered in a press engagement in Ouagadougou, was not bombastic. It was not for show. With a firm gaze and steady voice, he said, "We are not defying the world. We are defining ourselves. If sovereignty is offensive to some, let them be offended. We were not born to obey forever." Those words didn't come from a place of hostility. They came from a place of historical exhaustion. Generations of African nations have been told how to govern, how to trade, and how to survive, always through the lens of Western approval. Now, the very nations once considered underdeveloped are developing a new mindset. We don't need permission to be free. France's discomfort is palpable. The old balance of power, where African compliance was secured through economic threats or military partnerships, is unraveling. And for leaders like Macron, raised on the notion of French grandeur, the sight of Burkina Faso standing tall and unafraid is more than shocking. It's destabilizing. But what truly silenced Macron wasn't the force of Traoré's words, it was their clarity. In the past, resistance was often mischaracterized as instability. African leaders who challenged Western influence were branded as dictators, radicals, or threats to international order. But now, a new generation of African leadership is emerging. Pragmatic, patriotic, and unapologetically self-reliant. These leaders are not seeking chaos. They are building systems that prioritize African values, African voices, and African futures. Traoré is not leading alone. He stands alongside counterparts in Mali and Niger, all of whom have endured internal struggles and external pressures. Yet rather than collapsing, they've consolidated. Rather than begging for aid, they've begun investing in self-sufficiency. Rather than outsourcing their security, they are training and equipping their own defense forces. This shift has not gone unnoticed. From international boardrooms to policy think tanks, there's growing unease about the Sahel's pivot away from the West. But what some see as a threat, others see as a liberation long overdue. The Alliance of Sahel States is not just a regional security pact. It is a manifesto of modern African defiance, a rejection of the post-colonial blueprint that left countries rich in resources but poor in autonomy. In its place, the AES proposes a model built on shared defense, intra-African trade, cultural revival, and political independence. Western analysts are scrambling to reinterpret the situation. Some describe it as a rise in authoritarianism, others as populist nationalism. But these definitions miss the point. The AES isn't about ideology, it's about identity. Africa is tired of being lectured by nations whose wealth was built on African labor, land, and blood. Tired of development partnerships that only enrich foreign contractors, tired of debt traps disguised as aid, tired of media narratives that depict African agency as dangerous. Traoré's leadership style contrasts sharply with the images that typically dominate Western headlines. He wears no flamboyant military garb. He avoids grandiose parades or excessive ceremony. His focus is substance, restoring land to farmers, stabilizing border regions, promoting educational reform, and rooting corruption out of governance structures. These are not the actions of a tyrant. They are the steps of a rebuilder. In fact, the most radical thing Traoré may be doing is showing that African nations can govern themselves effectively without dependency. And that's terrifying for the old guard. France's response has, so far, remained rhetorical. But behind the scenes, there are rumors of diplomatic maneuvering, pressure on ECOWAS, lobbying in the EU, and subtle attempts to isolate the AES region economically. Yet even these tactics are beginning to lose power, because the world is shifting. China, Turkey, Russia, the Gulf states, they are all seeking new partnerships in Africa, offering terms that differ sharply from the paternalism of Western deals. Meanwhile, Pan-African solidarity movements are gaining momentum, both on the continent and in the diaspora. From Johannesburg to Chicago, from Accra to Paris, young Africans are organizing, publishing, and protesting with one voice. Africa decides for Africa. The silencing of Macron, then, is not just a diplomatic moment. It is symbolic of a wider loss of control. France no longer commands the narrative. The Sahel does. And it's not just political, it's cultural. In the towns and villages of Burkina Faso, music is changing. Songs glorify local heroes, not foreign presidents. Children are taught about Thomas Sankara alongside national legends, not just imported history. Across Mali, griots sing of modern victories alongside ancient ones. In Niger, young poets speak of dignity like it's oxygen, essential, invisible, and worth dying for. When Macron speaks, he invokes order, civilization, and democracy. But when Traoré responds, he invokes memory, sacrifice, and self-worth. Which of those speaks more to the soul of a people? The West often asks why African youth flee their countries in search of opportunity. Perhaps the better question is, what if they stayed? What if, under leaders like Traoré, they saw a future worth fighting for at home? That possibility terrifies those who have long relied on African instability to justify intervention, to extract wealth, and to maintain strategic dominance. Burkina Faso's revolution is not loud, but it is powerful. It is not violent, but it is unyielding. It is not anti-West, but it is anti-subjugation. The message is clear: partnership, yes; subservience, never again. As the dust settles on Macron's failed intimidation, one thing is undeniable. The world has heard a new kind of African voice, confident, calm, and unbending. And once a voice like that emerges, it cannot be silenced again. Traoré may not have sought global attention. He may not see himself as a global symbol. But in standing firm against coercion and declaring that Burkina Faso will walk its own path, regardless of Western approval, he has inspired a generation. Across the continent, the ripple effect is visible. In Congo, students are debating sovereignty. In Kenya, grassroots groups are calling for debt audits. In Tunisia, anti-IMF rallies echo the same call. Let us decide our fate. And while France may scramble to regain control, it will find that control was never its right in the first place. What Macron learned, what the world is learning, is that Africa no longer needs to shout. It only needs to speak clearly. And in that clarity, a new Africa is being born. One that will not be bought. One that will not be bullied. One that will not ask permission to exist on its own terms. That Africa is already here,